Hello. Hello. Thanks for joining me. Hit that like button. So we're going to talk about the Idaho College murders, the terrible, terrible tragedy that took place in November, where 4 college students were murdered. So we're going to take a look at, I took a look at the probable cause affidavit, which is the affidavit that supports the arrest warrant on Bryan Kohberger, who was charged with the 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of burglary. So I put a poll. Go ahead and take a look at the chat box. And by the way, you do need to subscribe to Michele's analysis to join our live chat. And by the way, happy 2023 to all of you. Happy 2023. Many good things to you in 2023. Okay, so go ahead and put your questions in there. I do already have some questions that some of you analyzers have submitted. So let me introduce myself for those of you who don't recognize me. I'm Michele Hagan. I'm a legal analyst and an attorney. I'm also a former prosecutor. You may recognize me because I provided a lot of legal analysis on the Elizabeth Holmes case, the Theranos case, the fraud trial, Sonny Balwani trial, the Cain Velasquez, etc. Many, many cases. So, like I say, this case is a terrible tragedy for all families. Sending condolences. It's a tough time. Terrible, terrible tragedy to lose your children. Also, keep in mind, this is just a video that's education information, just providing my analysis. At this point, Bryan Kohberger is presumed innocent of all charges. We haven't seen any of the evidence, but do take a look at the poll. I want to know what's your analysis, because I know many of you have been following the news. So do you think he committed without having seen the evidence, do you think he's committed the murders? Go ahead, and if you want to cast your vote, please do. Hit that like button. And by the way, if you want to support my work, give me a super chat. I put a link to the super chat, to the PayPal, in the chat box. Okay, so let's take a look at any of your questions. And you guys go ahead and say hello. Let me know you're there. Or are you too shy? Okay, so there's a dog involved. There's a DoorDash driver. There's a person who drove 2 of the girls from a food vendor back to the house. And then, according to the prosecution, there's Bryan Kohberger, who was seen leaving, according to one of the roommates, the 2 surviving roommates. One of them has stated that she has identified Bryan Kohberger as the suspect, as the person leaving early morning on November 13th from the house in Moscow, Idaho, nearby the campus of Idaho, University of Idaho, and also Washington State University. Okay, so any questions yet? All right, so I'm going to go ahead and talk to you. Let's see. We're going to look at the affidavit, and I think the case is Bryan. Are they going to paint Bryan Kohberger as a stalker? Someone who had a reason to murder these people. These poor, tragic, 20-year-olds. Or are they going to say that, somebody else did it? What's the defense going to say? Now, again, the arrest affidavit is based on probable cause. So they provide enough information to a judge to then issue an arrest warrant, which is when they got the arrest warrant. Then they did a raid on Kohberger's parents' home and arrested him back in December. So next stage is there's going to be a hearing on, it's going to be a status conference. I think it's on Thursday, the 12th, this week, where they're probably going to decide what date for the arraignment is going to be calendaring. So the next step will be the arraignment. At the arraignment, Bryan Kohberger makes a plea of guilty or not guilty. If he pleads not guilty, then it's set for trial. Now, I'm not an Idaho attorney. I'm a California lawyer, but I did my research. And in Idaho, they have to proceed to trial within 6 months of issuing, within 180 days, 6 months of issuing what's called the information, or you can think of it maybe as an indictment, where where the defendant is charged with these particular crimes. Now, the arrest warrant, the probable cause affidavit that we're going to look at, that relates to the probable cause to believe that Kohberger committed the murders and committed the burglary. Now, depending on what happens at the preliminary hearing, where the prosecution has to prove up, so there's the arraignment and the preliminary hearing, the prosecution has to prove up what enough evidence for the court to bind over or bound over, or to have probable cause to believe that these crimes were committed and that Kohberger was the person who committed the crimes. Then it's set for trial. Okay, then after trial, there's sentencing, and then there's an appeal if he gets convicted. Okay, so let me go ahead and just, before I get to that, I wanted to read to you to keep this in mind. So again, there's the arraignment, preliminary hearing, entry of a plea, status conference to figure out what the dates are going to be, pre-trial conference to check in with the judge to say we're ready to go. We need an extension or continuance because we need to get some witnesses, pre-trial, trial, sentencing, appeal. That's the way it goes, okay, in Idaho. In the jury, they have to have 12 jurors. It has to be unanimous. This is a criminal case. If he's convicted, the prosecution has to prove each element of first-degree murder, which is a willful, deliberate killing, premeditated killing of these 4 individuals, and he's also may be charged. We don't know if he's going to be charged with this yet, but according to the arrest affidavit, he's charged with the 4 counts of first-degree murder and the 1 burglary. We have to see how the preliminary hearing turns out. There may be additional charges. There may be less charges. We don't know. So if he's convicted on the burglary, again, each one of those elements has to be proved beyond a reasonable doubt. So what does that mean in Idaho? Okay, because each state has their own definition of reasonable doubt. Why reasonable doubt matters is because the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution requires that a defendant be given due process. In other words, a notice and a hearing, or in this case, information where he's charged, and then a trial. Okay, so this is what the jury instruction says, and this is where I start when I prepare cases for trial. What is the standard of proof? And I'll get to the affidavit in a second. I just want to read this to you. Presumption of innocence. This is the instruction that's read to the jury if this case goes to trial or for any case, criminal case in Idaho. Under our law and system of justice, the defendant is presumed to be innocent. The presumption of innocence means 2 things. First, the state, that means the prosecution, has the burden of proving the defendant guilty. The state has that burden throughout the trial. The defendant is never required to prove his or her innocence, nor does the defendant ever have to produce any evidence at all. Second, the state, the prosecution, must prove that the alleged crime beyond a reasonable doubt. A reasonable doubt is not a mere possible or imaginary doubt. Not a mere possible or imaginary doubt. In other words, maybe somebody else did it, or is that possible doubt? The defendant, okay, it is a reasonable doubt is not a mere possible or imaginary doubt. In other words, it's not speculation. It is a doubt based on reason and common sense. Reason and common sense. Looks like a duck, walks like a duck, it's a duck. It may arise from a careful and impartial consideration of all the evidence, or from the lack of evidence. If after considering all the evidence, you, the jury, have a reasonable doubt about the defendant's guilt, you must find the defendant not guilty. Okay, so reasonable doubt standard. That's what the prosecution has to prove. Each one of these elements, that Kohberger committed these murders, willful, deliberate, premeditated act. That's what's required for first-degree murder. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at. Please say hello in the chat box if you're there. And also hit that like button. Send me a super chat if you want to support my work. Okay, so let's get into, let me tell you what's in the affidavit and what's not, which I think is very interesting. So as a defense attorney, and I've defended cases too, you want to look to see what's the evidence that they're offering. And I just dropped it, so hang on a second. What's the evidence that the prosecution or the arrest warrant is substantiated by? Okay, so it's submitted by a police officer from Moscow Police Department. 4 years as a police officer. He submitted this affidavit to support the arrest warrant. In the affidavit, he says that he showed up at 4 p.m. The murders were apparently committed sometime between 4 a.m. and 4:20 a.m. according to this arrest probable cause affidavit. Okay, so as a defense attorney, you read through it and you try to figure out, okay, what's missing? Where are the inconsistencies? Who says what? What are the things that they can work with? Because they're going to be using this when they do the preliminary hearing, when the prosecution puts on enough evidence, the witnesses, the DNA evidence, the testimony of the surviving roommates. And again, this is a terrible tragedy. Terrible. It sounds like a brutal murder in which all 4 of these college students were stabbed to death. Terrible. And I'm going to get to that too. Okay. So this officer showed up at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The 911 call from one of the roommates was made at approximately noon. Murders apparently occurred at 4 a.m., 911 call at noon. So that's an 8-hour gap. Why is that? Then the officer shows up 4 hours later, even though there were already officers at the scene. So you might think, oh, is there a contamination of the scene issue? You know, if this officer shows up later, who was at the scene? What happened? Did they preserve the evidence? I'll give you an example. There's a latent footprint, which the affidavit says is consistent with Vans shoes, which is a pretty common shoe for college students to be wearing. That footprint was found outside one of the roommates' rooms on the second floor. That footprint was found on the second processing of the scene, not the first, the second. So that's kind of interesting. So an officer walked through, this officer who wrote the affidavit. So he was taken through the scene, took notes, they made interviews, he summarized it all, and he put it in this affidavit. Okay, so what's important about this is the layout of the house. And what's even more important is the timeline. Okay, so 4 people were killed. What amount of time happened? If they say, and I'll just give you the short of it. At 4 o'clock, DoorDash showed up because apparently one of the victims, tragically, I think it's Kern, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing the names here. Let me get the names correctly. I think it's Kaylee. No, it's not Kaylee. It is, sorry about that. I've got a bunch of notes. So it's Xana Kernodle called for a DoorDash, which the delivery was at 4 o'clock in the morning. Okay. So we're looking at the timeline. The officers are saying it's between 4 and 4:20 in the morning. The murders occurred. So you start to make a timeline and see if there's any inconsistencies. At 4:04, there's apparently a white sedan was seen in the neighborhood, which the officers believe was the white Elantra driven by the defendant, Bryan Kohberger. Okay, but they also indicate in the affidavit that the car was seen. It was trying to park near the house, made a 3-point turn. So you have to add a little bit of time there. Then we have at 4:12 a.m., one of the victims was online, and that was also Kernodle. So there's 4:12 a.m. Then we have 4:17. One of the neighbors' video cam picks up barking dogs, a thump, and a whimper. Okay. Then we have 4:20. The white sedan is seen leaving the neighborhood. So if we have the car there from 4:04 to 4:20, that is, if I did my math right, 16 minutes. So that indicates to me that whoever this is was familiar with the layout of the house. And why do I say that? Because it's a 3-story house. Okay, there's the first floor, the second floor, and there's bedrooms on each one of the floors. Upstairs were the 2 bedrooms, which is where Madison Mogen was in one of the bedrooms or had one of the bedrooms, and Kaylee Goncalves. And again, I apologize if I'm saying these names wrong. And so we have those 2 upstairs. Although they were found when the police officers showed up, the 2 young women were in. I think it's Madison's Mogen's bedroom. Okay, they were stabbed to death. They were on the 3rd floor. On the 2nd floor, there was the couple. There was Ethan Chapin and Xana Kernodle were on the 2nd floor. On the 1st floor, there were 2 other roommates, initials BF and DM. Okay, DM, it was interviewed by the police. She said that she saw a person all clad in black with a mask on, with bushy eyebrows, approximately 5'10", male, leaving the house through the back sliding door. She had, prior to that, looked outside 3 times because she heard noises. She was awoken approximately 4 o'clock in the morning. Okay, remember, DoorDash is delivering at 4. Xana Kernodle's online, according to her phone records, at 4:12. So 4:12 to 4:20 is 8 minutes. So we went from 16 minutes to 8 minutes. Okay. Now, again, these are all approximate, but time does matter. There's 4 people, 1 defendant. Okay. 4 victims, 1 defendant. So again, this is just my opinion. I'm just walking you through how I would be looking at this. What's the standard proof? What are the elements for each one of these crimes? What evidence goes to each one of these elements? Okay, so we have the 2 surviving roommates on the 1st floor. So she looked outside. DM looked outside when she heard a noise, and she thought it was, she heard some noise up above. So that's one story, I should say, above, because she had a 2nd floor bedroom. There was BF on the 1st, DM surviving roommate, and then the couple on the 2nd floor, and then the 2 women upstairs. Okay, so she was on the 2nd floor. She heard noise. She thought it was Kaylee playing with her dog. And then she opened the door again because she heard someone say, "Someone's here." Then she heard someone say, "I'll help you." And then she saw the figure pass by her. I don't know if he or she saw her or not, whoever the suspect was. The police believe prosecution believe it's Bryan Kohberger. So after she shut the door and she locked her door. And then there was a 911 call to the police approximately 8 hours later. Okay. Now you can understand that if she heard the screams, because there's a neighbor apparently that heard some screaming, some yelling, some screaming going on earlier. So if DM heard noises, if she was terrified, if she was in shock, locking her door, she may have passed out. I don't know. Okay. But keep in mind, this is a criminal case. All the defense has to do is convince 1 juror that there's reasonable doubt based on that standard that I read you. Okay. So go ahead and hit that like button. leave a chat. Any questions? I'll get to the questions in a second. Okay, so let me get into what else is in here. So they found the two women upstairs stabbed to death. One of the bodies was of the couple. The woman, which is Kernodle, her body was found laying on the floor. I assume Ethan's was on the bed, but they were also stabbed to death. And they said that it's caused by an edged weapon. Edged weapon. They don't say it's a knife initially. They say it's an edged weapon. Okay, then there's a dog. There was a dog found, according to the video cam, the body cam of one of the officers who was taking this officer who wrote the affidavit through the scene. There was a dog there. Now, the dog is very interesting to me. Okay, and I'll get to my theory towards the end. Okay, and that dog apparently is Kaylee's dog, and was found at that time in Kaylee's bedroom. There was also, it turns out the dog also belongs to Kaylee and her ex-boyfriend, Jack DeCure. Okay, so ex-boyfriend Jack DeCure, or DeCure. They interviewed Jack on November 13th, and he said that he shared the dog with Kaylee, but it's not in here whether or not Jack was at the scene, what Jack knows about any of this, so I don't know. I mean, what's unusual about this affidavit is there's a lot of information in here. You don't normally see this much. For instance, they did test the DNA, and they put the result in here. Normally, you may not see that, okay? So, and again, I think there are 35 police officers in this police department, and they probably have never seen this kind of a brutal murder. So, and a lot of people, the FBI was involved, the Idaho State Police were involved. A lot of resources were used to find out who did this. Okay. So, there was, as they entered the bedroom, where the two females were on the single bed. This is on the top floor. This is where Madison Mogen and Kaylee Goncalves were on the bed. They were both stabbed. That was the top floor bedroom, right? So one of the roommates heard the dog, which she thought was the dog was playing. There was a sheath, a knife sheath, okay? So this could be described as a 7-inch hunting knife, possibly. But on that sheath, there's a button snap. And on that button snap, according to the police, they found DNA. That DNA, they say, matches with Bryan Kohberger's father. Okay? So I'll get to that too. Anyway, there was DNA on the sheet that was found on the bed where the two women upstairs were stabbed to death. So maybe that ties it to Bryan Kohberger. We'll see. Okay, then they did a ton of interviews of people involved, and it turns out that the two women upstairs went to a bar earlier that evening. They also visited a street vendor. There's also video cam, apparently, or some witness who saw this white sedan that, again, the police say that Bryan Kohberger was driving. That sedan was in the area of that vendor around the time of possibly when these two young women were there. So does that indicate stalking? We'll have to see. Then what we find out in this affidavit, there was a private party, and the name is whited out in the affidavit. It's missing. That private party gave these two women, Madison and Kaylee, a ride from the street vendor back to their house. Is the defense going to argue that that person is a suspect? I don't know. Okay. So I'm just throwing it out there. At this point, we don't know what the facts are. Okay. I'm just analyzing. All right. So let's see. And then the couple, they had gone to a Sigma Chi party at the University of Idaho. They were home around 1:45. The two ladies were home around 1:56 in the morning. DoorDash shows up at 4 a.m. Okay, then let's see. DM, who was again second floor bedroom, so presumably underneath where the two women were. She said she again thought that Kaylee was playing with her dog. She thought that she was able to hear someone say, "There's someone here." She heard crying. She opened her door 3 different times to see what was going on. She heard a male voice say, "It's okay, I'm going to help you." Is that the male suspect, or is that the male boyfriend who was tragically killed too? And then there's dog was heard barking in the video, the cam from the neighbor's cam at approximately 4:17. So dogs barking. Okay. Let's see. Let me get to what else is in here. DM, when she was asked, she did not state that she recognized the male. She didn't recognize the male, whoever that person was. She says that she didn't recognize them. And the officers believe that that was the murderer leaving the scene, going out the sliding door. And the officers believe the murders occurred between 4 and 4:25. So what the defense is going to do and what the prosecution has to pay attention to, here's the timeline. Is it possible to stab, murder 4 people in 16 minutes, 8 minutes, if these times are correct? Okay. And again, the preliminary hearing will tell us a whole lot more. All right. So there's also the video cam of the neighborhood. So they spot a white sedan, which the officers believe is the same car that Bryan Kohberger owns, which is the white Hyundai Elantra. It didn't have a front license plate. So that's somewhat unique. They found it at the campus because one of the campus police at Washington State did a search of anyone owning a white Elantra or a white sedan, and they came up with one. Now, I don't know how big Washington State University is or how common the white Elantras are, but that's interesting. And what's also interesting to me is the amount of times that Bryan Kohberger was stopped by the police before this happened. And I'm sure this is what the prosecution's going to be looking at as well. Okay, I'll get to that in a second. But I just wanted to point out that, there's video camera surveillance of the area showing that there was a white sedan traveling through the neighborhood several times, okay? Especially during, it showed up at approximately 4:04 and was looking for parking, did the 3-point turn. So, have to subtract some time there. Anyway, they say that they saw the campus officer, they were doing surveillance on the car, or they looked at the surveillance video. I think that's right. Or is it from camera footage indicated that a white sedan was observed traveling. It was approximately 3:26 in the morning on the morning of the murders. And it appeared that vehicle did not have a front license plate. Well, Bryan Kohberger was stopped, I think it was in October, and cited by some police officers for not having a front license plate because that's what's required in Idaho, but he came from Pennsylvania. His car wasn't yet registered, so he didn't have front plates. So that was a distinguishing characteristic, I guess. So they have the car in the neighborhood sometime between 3:29 a.m. and 4:20 a.m. And they said that there were 3 passes this car made, whether they were looking for parking, whether they were committing murders, we'll have to see. And then the 4th time again at 4:04 a.m., seeing the car unsuccessfully attempting to park and turn around on the road right near the house, make a 3-point turn. And at 4:20, they see that vehicle leaving the neighborhood. They don't say who saw it. We don't know whose camera footage, if it's camera footage or if it's eyewitness. And again, the defense is going to inquire about that, right? How far were you? What was the lighting, etc. This is the early morning hours. So they see the car leaving the scene approximately 4:20, high rate of speed. So, what's also interesting is there is no footage of the car actually parking. So they just have the car around 4:04, but I don't know. I guess the neighbor's cam didn't catch that, or they parked at a different spot. I don't know. Okay, then the other thing is What's interesting in this affidavit is they sent all those video footage of this white sedan to a forensic expert at the FBI. What's interesting about this FBI's opinion is the FBI looked at these forensic video of the white sedan to figure out what kind of car it was, what year was it, what make, what model was it. So this FBI agent said that he believed that the car was a 2011 and 2013 Elantra. Well, Bryan Kohberger drives, or a car that's registered to him is a 2015. Then the FBI officer said, well, it could also be an Elantra 2011 to 2016. So here is two different opinions. And then there's a third one too. I'll get to that in a second. So the question is, the Washington State Campus Police ran the database. They found one white Elantra at about 2:44 in the morning. And then they saw the white Elantra traveling around 2:53 a.m. that same morning, headed to Moscow, Idaho, which is where the residence where these victims were tragically killed. Okay. So at approximately 5:25 in the morning, they pick up a white sedan again, which is consistent with the description of Kohberger's vehicle. But the FBI agent said that the Elantra could be now 2014 to 2016 model. Okay, so that captures the 2015 model that Bryan Kohberger was driving. So the car wasn't seen again until 5:25 in the morning. So if they leave the neighborhood at 4:20, the car returns, I assume, to the campus or to his home at 5:25. So that's an hour and 5 minutes. What was going on then? Okay. They didn't have surveillance. They don't have any tracking on him at that time, according to this affidavit. And again, this affidavit doesn't contain everything, right? There might be other DNA that they obtained at the scene. There might be other witnesses. There might be a whole lot of other evidence we don't know about. It's a very low standard. The probable cause standard is just enough to convince a judge to issue an arrest warrant. The preliminary hearing is where they roll out the evidence to again show to the judge that there's probable cause to believe that this is first-degree murder for all those 4 victims, and it's a burglary. And these crimes were committed by probable cause to believe that it was the defendant, Bryan Kohberger. Okay, then there's the arraignment, then it goes to trial. All right, so there's also November 29th, the Washington University officer locates the 2015 white Elantra. So the murders took place November 13th. The car is located on the 29th. So that's 15 days later. They find the car on the campus with Pennsylvania plates. So that might be consistent. We'll have to see. Then I want to talk to you about the stops. Now, why these stops are important is Bryan Kohberger is a 28-year-old male. His undergraduate is in psychology, you know, how people think, why people are motivated, blah, blah, blah. And also forensics. And I think it's technology forensics. Okay. So there's also 12, I'll call them surveillance of the phones, you know, pings from the towers. Where was Bryan Kohberger's phone? Well, according to this affidavit, there were 12 times Bryan Kohberger's phone went to the location of where these victims were murdered. He got the phone in June. The murders took place in November. 12 times. Why is he going to their house? Is it stalking? Or there's also other information. Is this house, I'll call it, it's known as a party house. They had a lot of parties. You know, this is college. They had a lot of parties. There were other houses in the neighborhood, apparently. They were also occupied by college students. They had parties. Maybe the defense is going to argue those 12 times he was coming to the parties. But it also could backfire because that would indicate he would know the layout. And also that would tie him to knowing these 4 victims possibly. Or did he just, you know, maybe the defense prosecution is going to say he had a fatal obsession. or maybe he was snuffed by her, turned down for a date, or that maybe he was just obsessed. Is that what the prosecution's going to argue? That this was a stalking? It was a stalking murder, and the couple below just happened to be there and they were killed? Or did this suspect have something against all these 4 people? Is the defense going to point the finger at these 2 surviving roommates? It's terrible, terrible tragedy for everybody. Or is the defense going to point the finger at the DoorDash driver? Or are they going to point the finger at, this is one of the defenses. You got the wrong guy. It could be the other roommates. It could be the ex-boyfriend of Kaylee. It could be the DoorDash driver. It could be the person that picked up Madison and Kaylee at the vendor and gave them a ride home. It could be anybody else who showed up at these parties. Okay, now I'm going to go out on a little limb here, because you got to get creative when you're doing trials. Is the defense going to argue that sheath that was found nearby Kaylee and Madison's murdered bodies, stabbed to death? How did that sheath get there with the DNA that looks like it happens to match Bryan, the defendant's father's DNA? Are they going to argue, is the defense going to argue the dog was playing with it? The dog found it at a party. The dog had been playing with it. Maybe the dog was, playing with it throughout the house and it picked up some DNA because Bryan had been to the parties. Is the defense going to concede that, yeah, maybe he was there, but that wasn't his sheath? It's very interesting. And the other thing is, for all of those out there who have those, 7-inch hunting, basically utility or hunting knives in a sheath, think about it. If someone's going to go into a house, and here's the other part I want to get to about the knife, okay? And why I think this is a crime of rage. Rage. Because when you pick up a knife and you stab someone, that is personal. That is personal. The suspect could have brought a gun and just shot. The suspect could have been laying in wait outside in the car and shot. No, went into the house, tracked them down, whoever it is the victim, and I think it was one of these ladies in the upper bedroom. Maybe they had a fatal attraction with, or maybe the suspect the defendant may have been laughed at, or the suspect was laughed at, or whoever committed these murders, these terrible murders. But when you take a knife, you feel it. That is rage. Now I'm going to connect it to, maybe this is something the prosecution is going to talk about, is the stops, the police officer traffic stops of Bryan Kohberger before this event. And why that's important? Because if he's a criminology PhD student, criminology, that means they want to study crimes. What motivates people? Why do people kill? All of that. And here's a guy who gets stopped. I think initially he got stopped for not wearing a seatbelt. Then he got stopped for not having a front license plate and got cited. Then he doesn't show up in court. He fails to appear, FTAs. Gets a default judgment against him on the citation. And I think as he and his father were driving back to Pennsylvania for the holidays with his father, I think he got stopped for speeding. So here's someone who's studying criminology, yet they don't care what the law is. They're not concerned about it. Does that indicate to you someone that, thinks they're above the law, or is going to outwit the police, or is doing this kind of tragic, brutal murder because they want to show that they outwit the police? And again, I'm just speculating here, okay? But I'm just looking at all of the facts. All right, so any questions in the chat? Or maybe I can't see the chat, I don't know. Okay, so let's see what else we have here. Yeah, so on October 14th, he was stopped by the Washington State University police. They have a body cam. I'd like to see the body cam of the stop where he was the sole occupant and he was driving with Pennsylvania plate. He on November 18th, He registered the car, finally registered the car in Washington. And I think that's when they found it showed up in the Washington's database, and the Washington State University officer found that that Wida launcher was on the campus and tied it to the defendant. Okay, so they also tracked the car after the murders. So on December 13th, it was tracked to Loma, Colorado. December 15th, it was in Indiana, and December 16th, it was in Pennsylvania because he was driving back home for the holidays, I imagine. Oh, thank you, Fabio. Nice to see you again. Thanks for your analysis. Late, just catching in. Thanks for joining me, Elaine. Thanks for joining me, Fabrizio. Happy New Year. Yes, thank you. I'm glad you love my videos. Okay, so then they did the cell records, right? So they got the cell records to figure out where Bryan Kohberger's phone had been, to say where he had been. And what's interesting is the phone had been turned off. The phone that's registered to Bryan Kohberger had been turned off on the morning or the early mornings of the murders. It was turned off between 3 a.m. and 5 a.m. Again, the police are saying the murders occurred between 4 a.m. and 4:20. Bryan's phone was turned off. Was it turned off because he was committing the murders? Was it turned off? Keep in mind, technology, forensics, and his psychology degree. He's a PhD student now, was in criminology. The phone is off. Why do you turn the phone off or put it on autopilot? Because you don't want to be tracked where your location is. Did he turn it off? Or was he not there in that area? The alibi, he was somewhere else. The other thing that's interesting, and they point out on the affidavit, is that when he was in the area of the house, those 12 times prior to this murder, his phone was on. That's how they know he was there 12 times. Is the defense going to argue that doesn't make sense? Because if he was there doing surveillance, if he was stalking, wouldn't he be turning off the phone? After all, he's a criminology student. Okay, so just throwing it out there. All right, so let's take a look at, let me see if there's anything else in here I wanted to show you. And they also say these were estimated locations of where his phone was. Estimated, okay? So again, they could maybe poke some holes at that. And then he went back to the scene. Bryan Kohberger, okay, can I say went back to the scene? How about Bryan Kohberger was at the scene of the crime, went back to the area of where the crime took place that morning at approximately 9 a.m., according to this affidavit by the police. Now, I know it's not uncommon for defendants to go back, especially arsonists, to go back after they've committed the crime to watch it all, how people deal, what resources are used, how they're going to solve it. They like to see all that. Maybe that's something the prosecution's going to argue. He stalked, murdered, and came back. Or is the defense going to say, no, he's just attended a bunch of their parties. The dog found the sheath, was playing with it. The DNA got transferred. Yeah, of course, he's been there. It's not his sheath, wasn't his knife. He wasn't there. The phone doesn't track him there. The ID witness, the roommate, who saw this figure all in black clothing with a face mask, bushy eyebrows, 5'10", Bryan Kohberger, 6 feet. It was early in the morning. What kind of lighting? Had she been drinking? All the questions you ask on identification of a witness. Okay, so what do you guys think? You got any theories out there? I put the poll if you want to vote in the poll. Okay, so let me see what else. Here's another thing that's interesting. Is there investigators are saying that the phone, Bryan's phone, did connect to a cell tower on November 14th, but so this is the day after. The investigators don't believe the phone was in Moscow at that date, but I guess he was there that morning, the morning of the murders. but not there the next day. How do they know his phone wasn't in Moscow, and where was his phone is my question. Where was he? And they're saying he was likely the driver of the Elantra, likely the driver. It's like there's no actual camera shot of a face of someone driving that car. You know how when you run, tragically, when you run a stop sign or a stoplight and the camera takes a picture, okay, if there's no front license plate, you don't have that, right? Unless there's a camera that takes a shot of the back license plate. But if you don't have a camera, you don't get the face. So what places Bryan Kohberger, the defendant, at the scene? The DNA that happens to match his father that's found on the sheath, that's very compelling. But, you know, DNA can get quite complicated. There can be inaccuracies. It was tested by the Idaho State Lab. What are their procedures? Could it have been contaminated, etc.? Could the dog have picked it up somewhere in the house? Could it have been transferred to the sheath? It's not his sheath. Would a hunter leave their sheath behind? Would you walk in with a knife within its sheath? Why wouldn't it be connected to your belt or something? I mean, just visualize this, okay? Or maybe don't visualize this. But anyway, I'm just trying to show you that there are some things here that I have quite big questions about. You know, maybe, you know, I used to prosecute domestic violence cases. Maybe this is just simply and tragically and terribly a murder at the hands of someone who was obsessed, someone who didn't get what they wanted revenge, was scorned, was a stalker, had a fatal attraction, and murdered all four of these people. So the question is, do they have enough time? You know, does that timeline fit with, I mean, if you're physically stabbing people, and there's 4 students, and I imagine they were, you know, healthy kids, healthy young kids fighting back. I mean, I think there probably were some defensive wounds. And one of the things that I heard is that Kaylee had a ton of stab wounds, more stab wounds than Madison. So what would that indicate to me? If that's true, Kaylee was the target and Madison happened to be there. And the other thing is how was the suspect able to control both of these young ladies and be able to stab them? And, you know, and then there's the couple downstairs, one of which, the gal, Xana, was online at 4:12, and at 4 a.m. she was getting DoorDash. So were they aware? I mean, were they awake? What was going on? Or were they all just so drunk they couldn't fight back? Okay, Bryan doesn't have a prayer. He's doomed. Well, Scorch 1028, I respectfully disagree with you. All the defense needs is one juror, and this defense attorney is the chief public defender. Now, I know I've heard it through my whole life. Public defenders, there was like, we don't want a public defender, they're crummy attorneys. Well, let me tell you, some of the best lawyers I know are public defenders. And why is that? And the best skilled, highly skilled? Because day in, just like when I was a prosecutor, day in and day out, we're doing trials. Day in and day out, we have to get evidence in. Okay? So this is the chief public defender. And what does she do? What does she do to prepare her case? She files a motion to preserve the evidence in the scene. So stop cleaning it up, because the cleaning crew had showed up and started to remove furniture, get out, you know, while there's a pending case. I thought that was kind of odd. So she filed a motion to stop because she wanted to go in and see what the scene is. So they videotaped it all, right? Because remember how I talked about the layout. The layout matters. How far is it from the second floor to the third floor? How far is it between those bedrooms? Did the suspect have enough time within that window? And that matters, okay? And it's presumed innocent until convicted guilty beyond reasonable doubt, okay? Not mere speculation, not imaginary doubt, not possible doubt. Has to be a reasonable doubt. Is it reasonable? And maybe, Scorch, maybe you're right about this. Is it reasonable to believe that anybody else would do this? But why would Bryan Kohberger do this? So the jury's going to want to know that. I know there's people out there saying motive doesn't matter, motive doesn't matter. But what's the connection? What's the connection to this brutal, tragic? And again, it's stabbing. That's personal. Personal. That to me indicates he knew, this suspect knew these victims. Knew them. Okay. All right. So anything else here? I think that's it for the affidavit. Anything else I pointed out? Oh, let's get to the DNA. And Hugo asked me this question. What about the DNA and can I explain it? So there was a DNA that was found on the sheath that was next to the two murdered ladies upstairs, next to Madison and to Kaylee. There was a sheath, a knife sheath. There was DNA found on the button snap. That DNA was processed by the Idaho State Lab. They checked it with DNA that was taken out of the trash of Bryan's parents' home. They tied it, apparently the DNA was connected to his father. So what they look for is the Y chromosome, because the Y chromosome goes through the men in the family. So if the police say it's someone related, has similar DNA to the DNA that was, that it matches the DNA on the sheath with the DNA that was found in the trash at Bryan Kohberger's parents' house in Pennsylvania. So whoever that suspect is with that DNA is tied to the male figure, his father, and they're saying it's a 99.99% chance that all other males in the population would be excluded. So in other words, less than 1% chance, or you could flip it. It's a 99% chance that it's that DNA that was found on the sheath is connected to Bryan's father. Is the defense going to say, yeah, Bryan went to one of these parties, was showing off the knife, dropped the knife somewhere, or dropped the sheath somewhere. The dog picked it up weeks later. It showed up for some reason in the bedroom. Is that what they're going to argue? I don't know. But again, it's reasonable doubt. Is that reasonable to believe that? Or is it more reasonable that someone who was going to the house 12 different times before got stopped by the police? Does that mean he doesn't care what the rules are, thinks he can outwit the police, is above the law, has anger issues, right? You're not going to, usually when you don't pay attention to the authority, right? Sometimes you have anger issues. Studying criminology, did he just create this whole scene so he could watch the world solve it? I mean, is that what this is about? Terrible tragedy for the families to lose their children. It's horrible. Okay. So any questions there? So, if the other thing is the judge rightfully, and I agree with this, put a gag order. It's called a non-dissemination order in Idaho. I call it a gag order. So the judge has gagged the prosecution, the law enforcement, anybody else involved in this case from talking to the public and the media. So this case will be tried in the courtroom, not in the courtroom in public opinion. Because believe me, I've seen plenty of people out there talking, and I don't know what they're talking about. Okay? So, this case will be tried in the courtroom based on the evidence that's presented. It looks like the prosecution has a mountain of evidence, the DNA that matches, the car scene, driving by, being in the area 12 times prior, shoe footprint. Does he have Van shoes? I don't know. Bushy eyebrows, identification, but all of that, the defense could, they focus on the timeline. They focus on, is the identification mistaken? Are there other possible suspects? Okay, so think big picture here. We'll have to see. Let me see what else I wanted to talk to you about. And again, to me, it's a crime of rage to take a knife because you feel it. Personally, when you're stabbing someone, those are crimes of rage. Okay. They didn't go in with a gun. They could have shot. They didn't have to feel it. They didn't have to feel the death. It's horrible. Okay, so let's see. I think I got all that. Okay, so now I want to talk about the questions. I guess somebody stole Bryan Kohberger's phone 12 times before the murder and lingered. Well, yeah, that's also what the defense could argue. His phone was stolen. Although it showed up later in a, still in his possession, apparently in his location. So they returned it to him, I guess. Or, he was stalking. Or, this may have been the party house for the campus. Sounds like a lot of people were in and out of that house, according to the neighbors. And there were 3 or 4 noise complaints where the police showed up and told them to settle down, right? So if it's a party house, maybe Bryan had gone to some of these parties. He wasn't the murderer. He just went to the parties. Maybe some of his DNA was left there. Somehow it transferred on the sheath. Don't know, right? It's not as clean and it's not a slam dunk like some of these people are saying, okay? Not a slam dunk. And we're going to see in the preliminary hearing where what the prosecution is going to put forward as their witnesses and their evidence, just enough to get the judge to find that Bryan committed these murders and burglary and that these crimes were committed. Probable cause to believe, okay? It's not the higher standard of reasonable doubt, which is what's required to convict a defendant in criminal cases in the United States, okay? So that means it has to be a unanimous verdict. And in Idaho, I did my research, they have to have 12 jurors. 12 jurors have to convict unanimously on each one of these counts. And I get it. There's people want to find this is terrible. It's brutal. The jury, maybe the jury's going to want to convict based on emotion, based on passion and wanting justice. But that's where the defense has to step in and say, read them those jury instructions and say, you cannot make your decision based on your passion, your interest in justice. You have to make it impartially. Remember, I read that, based on the evidence presented before you. And again, I'm trying to be even here. I'm not trying to take sides. I'm just trying to share my knowledge and my analysis. All right. So, and that 8-hour time delay, where neither one of these roommates call. And maybe that goes to the party house. Maybe they're used to having a lot of noise around that, they've kind of been acclimated to it. They don't think it's any big deal. But what is interesting to me is DM did say, according to the affidavit, according to what the officer said, she said, is that she did hear crying and she heard cries for help, but she didn't leave her room to go find out after the person had left, but locked the door. And I think that's absolute. And maybe it could be explained as shock. Or maybe there's something else going on. I don't know. Okay. But I'm sure it's terrible. It would be amazing if someone went through the trouble of framing. Well, we'll see what the defense says. Is this a frame job or is this a, stalking fatal attraction, and you don't, the defense doesn't have to prove that he's innocent. The defense just has to show that there's a reasonable doubt, and I tried in this video explain away some of this stuff, the sheath with the dog, the footprint, van shoes. Those are pretty common shoes. The car, they identified it as a white sedan, and there's, I guess, only one white sedan in that area. That's an Elantra. The FBI agent had 3 different model years and then came down to 2014, 2016, which is the 2015 that Bryan drives. I mean, yeah, it's very sad. Very, very sad. And then the police said initially there was no risk to the community because they thought it was a crime of passion, similar to the crime of rage that I was talking about. But then they changed their opinion. I don't know what that's based on. We don't know what else they know. I'm sure they know plenty more. I'm sure there's a lot more information out there that we don't know about because these affidavits or arrest warrants don't contain all the information. It's just enough to show that there's probable cause to arrest Bryan Kohberger. Okay, let me see. The defense can punch holes in a lot of the PCA, but I would guess the PCA is only a small fraction. Yeah, Mindy, good comment. Yep. And here's the thing. When a defense attorney looks at all angles, is there, how do they discredit the identification by the roommate? Had she been drinking? What was the lighting like? How many people have bushy eyebrows? She had the height wrong. He was she said 5'10", he was 6 feet. Maybe that's not a big enough discrepancy. Okay. And the defense is going to have to be very aware of the fact that, the community wants the person to be held. The families, we all want the person who committed these brutal murders to be brought to justice. Okay. So that's where jury selection comes in. You ask questions and make sure that these juries aren't going to just be a runaway train here because they want to find somebody guilty. I mean, there's reasons we have laws. There's reasons there's the reasonable doubt standard. And there's reasons that it has to be a unanimous verdict. Because when you're this sentence in this kind of a case, let me get to that, the penalties. So in Idaho, I did my research. If I'm right about this, on each one of these first-degree murders, willful, deliberate, and premeditated, driving around 12 times before, premeditated, scoping out the scene, getting to know the layout, maybe he attended this party to get to know the layout. Willful, not aware of him being on any drugs or any other thing that could mess with his willfulness to commit the act. Was it deliberate? Stabbing, I'm sorry, but that's absolutely deliberate to kill somebody. Okay. So each one of those first-degree murder counts could be the death penalty. But at this point, we don't know if they're going to be seeking the death penalty because we're not going to find that out until after the information, which will contain all the charges that they're going to go to trial on. At that point, we'll find out whether or not the prosecution is seeking the death penalty. If they don't seek the death penalty on these first-degree murder charges, then the minimum sentence is 10 years in prison on each count. The burglary charge is 1 to 10 years in prison. Okay? So, and that's a whole nother, first they have to convict, then there's the sentencing. There'll be sentencing motions, mitigation, aggravation. And if you want a clue, you can take a look at the video I did on calculating the sentence for Elizabeth Holmes in the Theranos case. Okay, so any questions? Any comments? Questions, comments, anybody? Let me see if there's any other notes. I think here's the statement from his parents, Bryan, the defendant's parents. They're expressing their sadness to the families. They care deeply for the 4 members. It's very sad. For the 4 individuals that lost their precious, for the families that lost their precious children. They pray each day for them, and they want to let the legal process unfold. And as a family, we will love and support our son and brother. So his family standing behind him. And the other thing is they haven't found the murder weapon. The knife has not been found. Now, some of you might say, some of you super sleuths out there might say, well, he took it with him in that hour period between 4:20 and 5:25, he dumped the knife. Or maybe he dumped the knife on the way home to Pennsylvania. So the next hearing is on Thursday, and it's probably going to be status to figure out when they're going to set the arraignment date and etc. And as I said earlier, once they file the information, which is where they lay out all the charges that they're going to proceed to trial with, once that is filed, the prosecution has to bring the case to trial within 6 months in Idaho. In California, it's much sooner than that, okay, unless they waive speedy trial. It's what's called speedy trial rates. If for some reason the prosecution doesn't bring it for 180 days and the defendant doesn't waive the speedy trial, meaning continuing it longer, then the case gets dismissed. That's not going to happen. It sounds like, the FBI has been involved in this, the Iowa State, the Moscow Police Department, the Idaho State Police, and several agencies have been involved, the Idaho State Lab. I mean, they have been working this case up. So the murders were committed on November 13th. Bryan was arrested, I think it was December 23rd. So, that's what, 6 weeks later or so, if I did my math right. So if any of you out there have any tips for these police officers, call 208-883-7180. Again, the tip line is 208-883-7180. Because I know we all want justice, right? We all want the person who committed this to be held accountable, okay? So any questions? Questions, anybody? I think I covered... Yeah, so, if, say, for instance, they concede the DNA, he was at the party, but it wasn't his sheath, somehow the DNA got transferred to the knife sheath. Or if he admits that's his sheath, I don't think he'll do that. But if he does, the prosecution's going to say, well, then where's the knife? So, let us test the knife. So it comes down to, is this a case of a stalker, of a fatal attraction, or somebody who wants revenge? And I think the tie, and again, I'm just throwing this out there. I don't know if I'm correct about this, and I don't know if I got the correct information. So please think for yourself, do your own research, and conduct your own analysis. That's why I created this, channel. I'm not just here to give my opinion. I want to encourage everybody to think about these things and apply critical analysis, right? If there were stab wounds reported more on one of the victims, maybe that was the tie. Maybe that was the reason. So we'll have to see. Okay. Anything else? I'm trying to see if there's anything else I wanted to talk to you about. Oh, your questions really quick here. Where did I put them? So yeah, Hugo, thanks for asking me the question. Again, wanted to know if there's enough hard evidence to justify a jury trial. Well, I don't know where you come up with this hard evidence term. I don't know what you're listening to. But anyway, what justifies a jury trial is a preliminary hearing where the prosecution puts on enough evidence, witnesses, DNA, or whatever they're going to put on, and there may be new evidence. We may learn some new things. We probably will in the preliminary hearing, because the prosecution has to put on enough evidence to convince a judge to say that there's probable cause to believe that Bryan Kohberger committed these crimes, and there's probable cause to believe that these murders and burglaries occurred. Once that happens, Bryan Kohberger is then being charged with these offenses. He's going to be bound over for trial. Okay, it's a probable cause standard. It's not a reasonable doubt. That's a much higher, the highest standard, because when you're looking at taking someone's life or their freedom by putting them in prison in this country, in the United States of America, according to our Constitution, we require that they be convicted beyond a reasonable doubt. And that's why we have jurors who, it's an amazing thing, you guys, amazing for all the jury trials I have done, to watch jurors who don't even know each other to reach a unanimous verdict or not. Okay? That's why we have in this country, the United States, we're presumed innocent, which I think is a very, very wise system. All right? How it plays out, it depends case to case, okay? Depending on what the evidence is. So again, if he's convicted on each one of these, he could be looking at death penalty or minimum 10 years on each murder count. They could also charge with the lesser, which would be if they find that it's not premeditated for some reason, or not premeditated, they could charge him with murder 2 or a lesser murder in Idaho. I don't know what that is, but that would probably be less than 10-year sentence. On the burglary charge, anywhere from 1 to 10 years. So, did the police catch the wrong guy? Or do we have a stalker who intentionally, deliberately, premeditated murder, crime of rage? So, if it goes to trial, that may be what the jury considers. And again, these are just my ideas, my analysis, my opinion, and just for education information. All right. Any other questions? Okay. So Hugo asked, what's my opinion? Will he get acquitted? Too soon to tell, Hugo. We have to see. I don't jump to conclusions. I follow the trail of evidence, piece it together. I don't take other people's opinions. I do my own research, and I have for my whole legal career. I have put cases together to convict people. I did a lot of child abuse and child molest prosecution cases, and I've worked with thousands of attorneys on preparing their own cases, whether criminal or civil, how to do an opening statement, how to cross-examine, how to pick a jury, etc. Okay. So yeah, they asked about the DNA. Again, it's the Y chromosome. It looks like it matched from the DNA that was obtained from his parents' trash to the DNA that was found on the knife sheath next to the two ladies who were brutally murdered. There's also someone else asked me whether, and forgive me, I forgot your name. There apparently is one of the Idaho professors is suing somebody for defamation. Now, again, I'm not going to really comment on that. That's a civil case, and I'd have to look at what the complaint is. But again, defamation. You have the right to say whatever. People can jump on any platform, espouse their opinion. They could, but if they say things that damage people's reputation, which potentially maybe it's this professor, I don't know, then you could be held accountable. There's penalties. You can say whatever you want, but you can also be held accountable for the consequences. So if you say things that damage people's reputation, ruin their businesses, ruin their careers, cancel them, you could be sued, okay, for defamation. There's free speech rights, the First Amendment. I'm a big fan of it, right? That's why I have this channel, and I want to know what, your opinion is, what your free speech is. I welcome it. What your analysis is. Free speech is we're very lucky we have it in the United States, right? And we have to protect it, in my opinion. So, yeah, the solution to false information out there is more speech, not less. If you're just given one side of the story, can you imagine trying a case and you have to take the opinion of the prosecution and you can't defend it? Can you imagine? You have to follow this version of the events. You can't question it. You can't ask for other people to give their opinion. Can you imagine? Anyway, don't let me roll on this. So, any other questions? Yeah, I went over the penalty. I went over the possible defenses. Okay, maybe I'll recover this. What do you make of the latent shoe print? So, Lacey, thank you very much for subscribing and joining. And to all of you, Happy New Year, Happy 2023. Please do support my work by subscribing. And if you want a super chat, I put a link in the chat box, and there'll also be a super chat link in the description box below the video. Okay, so Lacey, and I hope I'm saying this right, Bauer, maybe you already covered this. What do I make of the latent footprint? Latent suggests it's not visible. Okay, so what's interesting about the latent footprint, which they say is kind of a cross print, which matches, according to the police officers, matches a van shoe print. But the interesting thing about this, and I'm sure the defense will pick up on this, they didn't catch it in the first processing of the scene. They caught it in the second processing. So my question would be, well, who was there during the first processing? Was anyone else wearing Vans? Did the cleaning crew come in? And the latent footprint was found outside DM. She survived this tragedy. Outside her bedroom, which was adjacent to the couple that was stabbed to death on the second floor. So latent means it's a kind of a forensic analysis of the footprint to then go and test it to figure out what it looks like, okay? So van shoes, I imagine, are pretty common for college kids, pretty common for a lot of people. I mean, it's not like a stylistic high-end shoe that only a certain, people might wear, or because you have orthopedic issues, you wear a certain kind of shoe. I don't think it doesn't fall for that. So latent just means they didn't find it initially, is what that means. Okay, it's not visible, not made in blood, or am I getting that wrong? No, you're not getting it wrong. It's not visible. They saw something And they were probably, you're going to check the door frames. You're going to check anything that anyone would touch. You would definitely check the floor because you're looking for footprints. I mean, think these investigators are detectives. They're basically checking everything to see if they can pick up any kind of DNA, any kind of fingerprints, any kind of footprints, any kind of shoe prints, any of that, to piece it together to figure out who this person is. Because, these days we have DNA that we can test now to convict people that committed crimes a long time ago. Our technology is much more advanced. Okay. But what's interesting to me is this defendant's behavior, where he gets pulled over for not wearing a seatbelt. He gets pulled over because he doesn't have the front license plate, which was required in Washington, but not in Pennsylvania, where the car was registered and where he came from. And I imagine where he was raised. That's where his parents live. And then when he's given a citation for not having the front license plate and he's told to appear in court, he doesn't show up. He FTAs, fails to appear, doesn't show up in court. And this is a criminologist student, somebody who he applied, I think, to volunteer with the local police department. And he said it's reported. And again, a lot of this is based on what I have read. I haven't, maybe it's not evidence until it comes into the courtroom. But in that essay, he said that he wants to help rural police agencies with technology. Okay. So you're getting your PhD in criminology, yet you're not abiding by the law. So just think about all the other cases out there where, I'll give you one right now. Gabby Petito and Brian Laundrie. Remember the traffic stop that happened before she was murdered by him? He allegedly murdered her, where her body was found in the Grand Teton National Park in Wyoming. The traffic stop that occurred that we all watched what happened there. Gabby was crying, basically, in my opinion, classic victim of domestic violence, but the police officers had a different opinion. But the traffic stop, it's almost like they're trying to stop you from committing things. And here's a guy, maybe it's just, he's new to the neighborhood. He moved out cross country from Pennsylvania to Idaho. He didn't know what the law was, but he's a criminology student. They're like detectives. They research. He was going to get a PhD in it. He was pursuing a career. He wanted to volunteer in a police department, yet he doesn't wear a seatbelt, doesn't have a license plate. Maybe he was speeding with his father on the way back to Pennsylvania. That's kind of odd behavior. And also, to me, those are red flags. So, any other questions before I sign off? I don't want to keep you too late here. I think I covered it all. So, thank you very much. Thank you for joining me, everybody. I wish you the best in 2023. Many, many good things to all of you. Thank you again to all of those of you who supported my channel, who continue to support my channel and send me your great questions and your analysis. I love it. Thank you, Doug. Thank you, Lacey. Thank you. And again, watch this video again and think about, what would you be saying? What do you think about the evidence, the evidence that's presented in the affidavit so far? Okay. So we've got the arraignment coming up. We'll see what happens on Thursday at the hearing. I think, again, that's just going to be status. They'll set a future date for the arraignment. There's going to be the arraignment, then the preliminary hearing. Maybe we'll find out some new things. Then they're going to file what's called the information, which is the list of charges. And maybe then they'll tell us whether they're seeking the death penalty or what the penalties are that they want. And then it will go for trial, right? They'll have a pretrial conference. Then it'll go to jury trial. 12 jurors have to convict. Has to be unanimous in criminal cases. All of them have to agree to convict. If one juror is unsure, thinks there's reasonable doubt, finds reasonable doubt, then he will not be convicted. It's what's called a hung jury, undecided. That gives the prosecution an opportunity to retry it. So we'll have to see. But just my take on the defense attorney, she's the chief public defender, the head. That's who's representing him. So the fact that she's already gone to the house, videotaped it for the layout, asked the judge, and the judge ordered to preserve all the evidence so they can take a look at it. We'll have to see. You know, DNA cases, sometimes juries get confused. Cases where they don't have an actual, picture of who did it, sometimes jurors acquit. So it really depends on the advocacy. It depends on how they present their cases, and it depends on the evidence that's presented to the jury. All right. So thanks again, all of you. Please hit that like button. Thank you very much for joining me. I appreciate all of you. Thank you again for supporting my channel. And please do support my channel by subscribing. And if you want to send me a super chat, greatly appreciate it. I'll put the link in the chat and in the description box below the video. Last note, Elizabeth Holmes, I think it's Monday. It's her motion to basically stay at home pending appeal. So that's scheduled on Monday. So we'll see what else happens this week. And thanks again.